We continue here. Ugandan lawmakers this week tabled a bill before Parliament that proposes tougher penalties for same-sex relationships. Homosexuality is already illegal in Uganda. acAccess Chapter 2 Executive Director Steve Letsike joins us to unpack this controversy. Steve, good to have you on the program this evening. Now, while more than 30 African countries, including Uganda, already ban same-sex relationships, this new law passed on Tuesday appears to be the first to really outlaw merely identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and queer. What do you make of this move?
No, thank you so much for the invitation and good evening to your viewers. Look, this is devastating because this draconian new legislation targeting LGBTI people, it's deeply disturbing, and it's problematic if Parliament, passing of this law it makes it the worst of its kind, really, to be honest, and it's deeply troubling development, not only just for Uganda, but for the region and for the world. You would understand that Africa has an agreement of some sort of the Freedom Charter.
Yeah.
The world has an agreement on the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And Uganda is among the countries that is signatory to that. But domestically, Uganda then becomes the worst country to even want to suggest a passing or a signing of this law that really will criminalize and will actually seek to even target many other people more than just LGBTI, including journalists, families, and so forth. It's problematic.
Let's now speak about the effect that such a law also creates in community members. It would seem that community members are really living in fear in Uganda and many parts of the world where such laws are also in effect.
No, indeed. I mean, across the world, we have now 69 countries across the world that still criminalizes homosexual act. You would understand one of the things of this law that is passed by Parliament, it proposes even the extent of death penalty for the offense of aggravated homosexuality. I mean, life imprisonment for the offenses of homosexuality. I mean, just on its own, you can see the levels of which they have thought about it and how it can criminalize people just because, one, they are consenting adults, two, but they also choose to love. And it's very problematic because it actually is developing a systematic violation of human rights that poses an inside hate and inside a violation against LGBTI people.
Now, furthermore, violations under the law also involve steep penalties, like you said, including the death penalty for so-called aggravated homosexuality and even life in prison for gay sex. This really does create unsafe and also very threatening conditions for people there.
Absolutely. I mean, look, this is not the first time Uganda is doing this. You would recall the first introduction by a private member's bill was done in 2009 by Bahati, member of parliament called Bahati then. And what we've seen since then, it's really an escalation of abuse, of harassment, of hate and of vulnerability. Because since that law was actually introduced in 2009, we saw violation against LGBTI people. A newspaper article with front cover with a list of known out LGBTI people with their pictures and address. And we've lost even a human rights defender then, David Kato, who was openly gay but also an activist in that country. And we saw a kind of an escalation where LGBTI people are seeking asylum and refuge outside their own country as citizens and born of their own parents and of their own family. Now you actually don't have a place in Uganda. And we're finding it very problematic that, the fact that this law suggests levels of criminalization, and that actually is based on measures of consenting. And I think what's also it's really confusing the relation of what's consenting and what's non-consenting for that matter. And it's very problematic law, and this is why, even as activists, we've been calling our own government, we've been calling really allies outside to stand up for Uganda. And I'm really hoping that we can all aim to really push in a way that could suggest that the president of Uganda, Museveni, does not actually sign that law because it potentially will cause harm and potentially will cause hate and death for many.
Now, Steve, when looking at the Uganda case, in recent months, conspiracy theories also accusing shadowy international forces of promoting homosexuality have really gained traction on social media in Uganda. Give us your observations, please.
Look, we've seen these developments, and there's a huge anti-gender, anti-rights movement that is rising. We see actually hate being imported into many countries. And I think the parliamentarians themselves were never even hiding. I think the Speaker of Uganda was never hiding in terms of who is sponsoring some of these outside. But we've seen the U.S. religious fundamentalists who actually contribute to the idea of what is protecting families, what is protecting womanhood, and so forth. And we actually have been reading all of these things. I mean, the recent meeting that has taken place in the UN just couple of weeks ago, which is this was reflection on Beijing platform, the Commission on the Status of Women. There was huge debates about what is really happening around anti-gender movement, toxic masculinity, and human rights that is now being undermined in many ways. And we need to be very clear, because any of these things that people are talking about, it's not about values. It's what my own observation actually then says that we are actually seeing a promotion of violence and discrimination, of hate against people for who they are and who they love, for that matter. And that's what we're seeing. And this movement is growing. It's well-funded, well-resourced, and must be exposed.
You look at the likes of Frank Mugisha, who's the Executive Director of Sexual Minorities in Uganda, really a leading gay rights organization whose operations were suspended by authorities last week. He's told various media outlets earlier this month that he had already been inundated with calls from LGBTI plus people over this new bill. Where do they really then run for help? Or people in this particular communities, where do they find help?
You know, I think we must really pay tribute and honor the bravery of the likes of Frank Mugisha, who's a comrade and friend of mine, and many other activists who remain in Uganda to actually go head on into challenging this law, into calling out their own government, but also into raising allies. You would understand SMARC. Of course, not only just SMARC, other queer organization in Uganda. The NGO Bureau of Uganda released a report a month ago that suggested that any organization that seems to be promoting homosexuality, that seems to be recruiting, they say, and sometimes we have to even worry what recruitment is this a job opportunity of some sort? But anyway, where organizations and activists like Frank go, they are members of the Commonwealth Equality Network. They are members of many networks, ILGA and so forth. But they also have friends and allies. We do have both in the global north and also in the global south, people who stand up for. But I think the most important thing, we should never skip our own continent to seek for help. If our brothers, sisters, our siblings in this continent, like what government of South Africa and even our ruling party, which is ANC, we called for a better Africa, a better world. And this is where we rise to stand in solidarity. We must not only just rise on the situation of Palestine or Cuba. We must also rise about situation of human rights violation, of what is happening here. People in Africa stood with with us during apartheid and kept people in exile in these very same African countries. And we can actually return the favor by making sure that no African, and in particular Black African for that matter, should continue to be violated in this region.
Steve, always good having you on the program. That was acAccess Chapter 2 Executive Director Steve Letsike, of course, talking us through that controversial bill that's expected to be signed into law out in Uganda.